My name is Abigail Barrett, and this is From Silence to Harmony, Composing Classrooms of Connection, my magnum opus. I wear a few important hats. I'm a wife, a mom, a musician, and an educator. I actually began my career as a professional singer, dreaming of traveling the world and performing, but life had different kind of harmonies in mind for me. When I got married and started a family, my focus shifted and I followed in my mother's footsteps, who was in education. She was a teacher, a principal, then a curriculum representative, and now writing her own books on trauma informed instruction. I started in general education, and later I was able to marry my two passions, music and teaching, by earning a certification in music. This fusion led me to my current work with Education Through Music Los Angeles, a nonprofit that partners with underserved schools to ensure all students have access to that high quality music education. We currently serve 45 schools, and I am an instructional supervisor developing a new role as intern and mentor teacher specialist to help recruit teachers to support the pipeline and fill educator gaps and help our current teachers become highly qualified, confident educators. Talking about symphonic thinking, Daniel Pink, in A Whole New Mind, describes it as the ability to recognize patterns, connect ideas across boundaries, and make bold leaps of imagination, like a conductor bringing together different instruments to create harmony. I first felt this idea come to life during the work with my critical friend group. Through honest collaborative conversations, we uncovered shared challenges and unexpected connections across our different roles and experiences. That space helped me realize how powerful it is when we bring curiosity and multiple perspectives together. Symphonic thinking is about seeing the bigger picture, mixing logic, emotion, and imagination to find creative, human centered solutions. I saw this when using the street data tools. These tools helped reveal patterns I hadn't noticed, like who was being called on or who was ignored, or how those small moments helped shape the students' experiences. Dr. Lori Desatel works in trauma informed approaches, and in her book, Connections Over Compliance, it reminds us that behavior, engagement, and learning aren't separate. They're all connected, just like parts of a symphony. And finally, when I worked side by side with one of my teachers to implement these tools, the street data tools, I saw symphonic thinking in action again. We had to stay open, be creative, and imagine new ways to center student voice. That process wasn't just practical, it was truly transformative. Symphonic thinking is essential to understanding equity because it forces us to resist in the out of box thinking, or in the box thinking rather, and the one size fits all solutions. In my experience, students from marginalized and multilingual communities are often silenced, not intentionally, but by systems that don't value their voices. Equity is not about fixing students, but about transforming the system. And in that sense, equity is not about uniformity or conformity, it's about harmony. When defining equity and equality, my professional definition of equity has certainly evolved. I used to think it just meant giving everyone the same resources, but now I see equity as the intentional practice of dismantling barriers or tearing them down so that every learner can thrive, not just survive. As John Dewey wrote in 1930, education must be a process of continual reconstruction of both self and society. And this reminds me that equity isn't static, it's not an end goal, it is an ongoing act of reflection and redesign. Excuse me. By contrast, equality assumes everyone starts from the same place. It focuses on the sameness, on giving everyone the same thing. As the OECD put it, true inclusion depends not only on access, but on agency. So, where equality builds uniformity, equality builds belonging. And this is just the perfect picture to help visualize equality versus equity. And this quote just really hits the nail on the head for me. Lindsay Ott in 2017 explained equity as not giving every student a size 10 shoe. Equity is giving everyone a pair of shoes that fits. So, not giving everyone the same shoe, but giving everyone the shoes that they need. The equity issue I chose to explore is what I call the equity gap, broken connections, and silent voices in multicultural classrooms. In my role as an instructional supervisor, I work across several schools that serve marginalized communities. One specific situation stood out to me. A veteran teacher returned after a medical leave only to find it difficult to reconnect with students, and it was just really difficult. During her absence, a long term sub had built strong classroom culture centered on student voice, agency, and cultural awareness. The shift in classroom dynamics has exposed issues around belonging and engagement and raised very critical questions about how teachers are supported in creating these inclusive spaces. This issue matters to me, not just professionally, but personally. Early in my career, I saw how disconnection between teachers and students, especially culturally diverse classrooms, can quickly lead to behavior challenges, lost learning time, and low trust. And I've also witnessed how quickly students can shut down when their voices aren't heard or they don't feel valued. As Dr. Lori Desautels reminds us in Connections Over Compliance, you'll hear me reference that quite a bit, all behavior is a form of communication. And that's why this issue is so important to me and why I believe it's worth diving into with honesty, empathy, and action. Street data, um, as defined by Saphir and Dugan, is qualitative human centered information that emerges from listening to those closest to the inequities. Um, in street data, the authors explain that real change begins not with test scores or surveys, but by listening to those closest to the margins, especially students in underserved communities. Kudos to Saphir and Dugan for pointing that out. Street data is zooming in and taking a real look, even when it's not very comfortable to do so. Street data is reimagining the norm and thinking outside the box. One idea that deepened my understanding of equity and street data comes from Collins and the concept of the curb cut effect, originally designed for people with disabilities but ended up benefiting everyone. By elevating the voices of students who are most often unheard, we end up improving the system for all learners. The tools I used from Chapter 4 of Street Data are the Equity Participation Frequency Tracker, Teacher-Student Interaction Observations, Post-Feedback and Reflection, and Student Shadowing. I started with targeted observations to better understand the dynamics between two teachers I supported and their students. These classrooms were facing behavior and engagement challenges, and I wanted to see if cultural disconnects or communication patterns were contributing to these issues. I looked closely at who was participating, how feedback was delivered, and whether the environments fostered equity and inclusion. My goal was to approach this work neutrally, but with an intentional anti-racist lens. I know I bring my own perspective and my own bias, but I was committed to recording what I saw without judgment so the data could speak for itself. Once again, as Dr. Lori Desautels reminds us, all behavior is communication. If we listen closely, we can uncover what students are trying to tell us, and that's beyond their words. The next thing I did was I used targeted observations after we had had an opportunity to exchange feedback and reflect with one another on the previously implemented street data tool. These conversations were valuable context to my observations and helped identify concrete ways to co-create more inclusive learning environments. This was followed by my final street data tool, the student shadowing, which really helped shed light on the importance of connections. This helped the teacher understand that I was working with what helps students feel successful and connected. On a local level, I learned that using the street data tools and philosophy uncovered central equity issues in this context. The uneven access to student voice and engagement stood out. Um, One key insight was that this isn't just an instructional gap, it's a relational and systemic issue. The way teachers connect with students, manage classrooms, and create space for student agency is often shaped by that unconscious bias and outdated models of control or conformity. Street data helped me zoom in on the how daily interactions, participation patterns, and teacher language either invite students in or pushes them out. A second learning came from observing that many teachers, even with good intentions, were prioritizing content over that connection. And this is where the street data philosophy really shifted my lens. As, once again, Dr. Desatel emphasizes, relationships must come first. I hear that all the time. I've heard it all through my educational career, especially in trauma impacted or marginalized communities. If it doesn't, their learning and human selves takes the back seat. Third, I realized that transformation is possible, but it has to be intentional and collaborative. Through my work, I'm now partnering with initiatives like the Residency Lab and Watts of Power Foundation, who are helping reimagine the educator pipeline to reflect and serve our students more equitably. These partnerships gave me hope and momentum for systemic change. On a national level, I've learned that inconsistent opportunities for student voice and engagement are not isolated just to my local area. They're much larger and it's a systemic issue. First, the national data from the Education Trust shows that students in high poverty, high diversity schools consistently experience less student led learning and fewer chances to exercise voice or agency. These patterns are reinforced by that standardized curricula and test driven accountability systems, yuck, which often leave little room for relationship driven or culturally responsive practices. Second, rigor is often mistaken for rigidity. According to Learning for Justice, many schools define rigor in ways that prioritize control and compliance over curiosity and engagement. Third, I saw hope in the Pipeline Remix conference I attended this October. There, I connected with a national network of educators and organizations actively reimagining the educator pipeline. Groups like the Watts of Power Foundation are recruiting and supporting Black male educators through residency models, while others are partnering with the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing to create equitable, grant funded pathways into teaching for people from historically excluded backgrounds. These insights came through the research I did to answer the discussion questions and the great resources that were provided in this course, the equity reports, and the powerful conversations I had both with my critical friends as well as the conference. And all of them affirmed that meaningful systemic change is not only necessary, it's already in motion with one person at a time. Looking beyond the US, I found that several countries are intentionally embedding student voice and cultural identity into their education systems, making these central to equity. We should take a note. First, New Zealand's curriculum. Their curriculum integrates Maori perspectives and emphasizes relational teaching. Valuing connection and cultural relevance is an essential part of their learning, not extra. And this aligns with Dr. Desatel, focus on relationships over compliance. Second, Finland gives students significant autonomy in their learning, trusting teachers to tailor lessons to local contexts and student interests. When I earned my credential, my cohort would often talk about and reference Finland and their practices, and we'd often ask, what would Finland do? Because their approach represents a high standard for equitable education. Third, British Columbia, Canada, is actively decolonizing its curriculum by including First Nations worldviews, reshaping both content and pedagogy to reflect and respect the Indigenous knowledge. I discovered these again through course readings, the research, professional learning events like the Pipeline Remix Conference, which highlighted these global models of equity in action. Stepping back and taking a look at equity on all levels, equity is relational before it is instructional. At the local level, using the street data tools, especially shadowing, showed me that what often looks like classroom management issue is actually a connection issue. Um, you know, they were disengaged because they didn't feel seen or heard. And this aligns with what I saw nationally. Across many U.S. schools, standardized systems continue to prioritize that control over connection, and in doing so, silence the student voice. This comes from the Education Trust and Learning for Justice reference resource. Real change requires emotional courage and proximity. This experience reminds me that equity work is emotional work. I learned how vulnerable this process can be, not just for students, but for teachers too. What surprised me most was how quickly a teacher shifted from resistant to reflection after seeing the classroom from her students' perspectives. This emotional shift, fueled by proximity, was the true catalyst for change. Equity isn't a checklist, it's a mindset. Globally, countries like New Zealand, Finland, and Canada are showing what's possible when voice, identity, and relationships are centered in system design. This confirmed for me that equity must be a way of being, not just a strategy. As Chapter 5 of Street Data reminds us, equity is a fundamentally pedagogical. Students must see themselves in the learning space in order to engage meaningfully. In my future, leading with empathy and curiosity, not assumptions. Co-creating relational spaces with teachers where emotional safety is prioritized. Centering student voice and belonging, and that will be a non-negotiable. My future work, equity, is not about fixing others, it's about reimagining together. Before this course, I cared deeply about equity, but I realize now that my understanding of it was limited. Now my understanding has deepened in three key ways. Effectively, I've developed a more compassionate lens. This experience helped me feel emotionally in depth or in tune with it, how it impacts people on a human level. I saw firsthand the toll that disconnection and invisibility takes on both students and teachers. Behaviorally, I've changed how I lead. I now prioritize connection and trust in relational context over just fixing instruction or, trying to meet the standards. Cognitively, I now understand equity as a system of relationships and structures, not just a goal, but a mindset and a daily practice. In the most direct terms, equity in education is the intentional ongoing process of identifying and demanding that barriers be knocked down so that every learner can thrive. And finally, returning to symphonic thinking, my equity magnum opus, From Silence to Harmony, Composing Classrooms of Connection. This title reflects both symphonic thinking and my redefined understanding of equity in music. A signal cuts through noise with clarity and intention, just like student voice must cut through systems of silence. This work isn't about volume, it's about resonance, ensuring every student's experience is felt, valued, and reflected in the learning space. Through symphonic thinking, I've learned that equity is not one instrument playing louder, it's the intentional harmony of many voices, each with its own tone, tempo, and truth. And my role as a leader is to help conduct that symphony. Thank you.